Dr. Hahn, welcome. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you very much. It's really excellent to be here at the Milken Institute and just appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation.
Wonderful. Well, COVID-19 has changed the game for virtually all aspects of our society. As we have discussed this week during this virtual convening, the impact of the virus has been felt by every sector, including financial markets, academia, as well as the healthcare ecosystem, from hospitals to medical research institutions. As a result, more than ever, we are hyper aware of the latest in vaccine and therapeutic development, and for good reason. The quicker we get to a cure, the sooner we get back to normal, or our semblance of a new normal. And at FasterCures, since early March, we've been tracking on a daily basis the developments in this area. As of this week, there are more than 250 treatments in the pipeline and nearly 170 vaccine candidates, which is truly unprecedented. The world's attention is now on this new modern-day space race. But instead of reaching for the moon, we are reaching for a cure, as our name implies with FasterCures. The FDA is firmly in the center of this effort, and action on its part is a critical factor as we move forward to a safe, effective, and viable cure that is rooted in sound science. At the same time, the FDA is engaged in drug approvals for conditions unrelated to COVID-19. So its influence and impact is being felt on everything from oncology to diabetes. This is an epic task under any normal circumstance, but in the era of COVID-19, the stakes are even higher. So why don't we just kick off, Dr. Hahn? I know you had a marathon session on the Hill yesterday. So the first question is, have you slept? How are you doing? How's your staff doing?
So I've certainly slept, and thank you for asking about that. It's really always great to have an opportunity to inform the American people through whatever medium about what's going on with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic. That's one thing we have seen over and over again, that the American people want to hear about what's going on. They want accurate information and they want transparency. And it's something that I think is really important to the agency and important to me personally. You know, we have over 17,000 employees at the FDA, scientists, physicians, pharmacists, nurses, our commission corps. They have really been working around the clock to address this pandemic. And I am so proud of the work that they've done. They have shown a remarkable commitment and dedication to our public health mission. And, you know, I'm going to start off by thanking them. They truly are just a remarkable group that are great public servants. And just to highlight one thing that I mentioned yesterday at the testimony, we are on track to meet our user fee goals for this fiscal year, which when you think about the volume of applications we've received related to COVID on top of our normal work, I think is a truly remarkable achievement by the people at the FDA. They are superstars, and I want to thank them in public here.
Yeah, absolutely. I can only imagine the tireless hours that they're putting into that. I don't think everyone is fully aware of the full scope of FDA's activities and all that you are regulating on behalf of the American people. Can you describe a bit about how you were involved in everything from diagnostics to therapeutics, even to hand sanitizers, as we saw the news this week about being cautious about certain sanitizers on the market?
Right, exactly. Who knew that a cancer doctor such as myself would become knowledgeable about hand sanitizer? That is so true. Well, just to put it in perspective, FDA regulates a wide variety of consumer and medical products. In fact, 20% of the products that consumers spend money on, so 20% of that GDP related to consumer product spending, medical product spending, is regulated by FDA. So has a significant impact on those industries. And obviously, as you pointed out, is almost the pointy edge of the spear for our response to COVID, in that it in some sense is the gateway to getting medical products into the hands of providers and to consumers. So let's start with food, which is of course the F in FDA. We are responsible for about 80% of the food supply in partnership with USDA, who's responsible for the other portion of it. We have taken very seriously our commitment to a safe and secure food supply. And of course, as you know, we had unprecedented demand for food during the height of this pandemic. At one point, the folks in our food group had estimated that this was similar to having 7 Thanksgivings in terms of food demand, which of course is one of the highest, if not the highest food demand period in the US. And because of that demand issue, and because of effects on the supply chain across the country and the world, we did see some regional shortages of commodities, which thankfully were taken care of. We also have the issue of protecting our food workers because when critical infrastructure workers, such as food workers, get sick with COVID-19, that affects our ability to produce food and to manufacture food and to get it out into the supply chain. So all of those issues were issues that FDA confronted. But let me just tell you, like with all of our other medical products and our other products that we regulate, it was done in partnership with the private sector. And I would like very much to emphasize that it's this collaboration, it's this single-mindedness about getting through the pandemic, about helping the American people and doing it in partnership with the private sector that really helped us get through this. If you look at some of our other products, personal protective equipment, diagnostic tests, which of course is a pillar of our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I mentioned the ventilator issue with many patients needing to be on ventilators during this crisis are regulated by FDA. We are responsible for, of course, drugs, biologics, vaccines, all the things that are now top of mind for Americans. So a wide swath of the products that are really important to all Americans, to all of the world during this time.
Well, that's a great way to pick up, which is what's top of mind for everyone. As we're tracking the development of treatments and vaccines, where are we with antivirals, with antibodies? You talked a bit yesterday about convalescent plasma, with the vaccine development. How quickly can we expect to see a therapeutic on the market, either by this fall or by the end of the year? And how does that timeline shift with the development of a vaccine if we get a therapeutic to market first?
Yeah, really good questions. And let me start by stepping back a bit. FDA's role as the regulator is also as an enabler to get innovative products on the market. So what we want to do, and President Trump asked us to do this, is to remove any unnecessary barriers to getting products to the market. And that's so important during an urgent public health situation such as COVID-19. So we have done that, and we've done that in a variety of ways. And I'll give you an example about one antiviral, which is, of course, remdesivir. The clinical trial was put into place in the early time of this pandemic. It completed in a very short period of time. It was sponsored by the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Disease. And its preliminary results showed a statistically significant benefit in terms of reducing the number of days, hospitalized days for sick COVID-19 patients. And of course, we immediately looked at those data. One of the things FDA does is we don't just read a press release. What we do is we look at the actual data that the sponsors, in this case, the National Institutes of Health, has, and we analyze the data. And we determined that the data that we had allowed us to issue something called an emergency use authorization. Now, that's not the same as an approval, but what it does give is allows us to get this drug to the market for those sick hospitalized patients that were the subjects of this clinical trial, give information to providers, and allow the company and U.S. government to distribute that drug. So really, if you think about it, that drug is in the hands of providers for sick hospitalized patients. Now, we'll learn more about the use of remdesivir as those trial data mature, and it could very well become an approved drug for COVID-19. If we think about other things such as dexamethasone, there was a recent trial completed in the United Kingdom. Again, we don't approve drugs on the basis of press releases, but dexamethasone is a corticosteroid. It's a drug that's very commonly used. It's already on the market. So unlike remdesivir, which is an investigational drug, dexamethasone is a steroid. But we've looked at that data, so has the NIH, and it looks to have a significant effect on COVID-19 patients in terms of reducing death from COVID-19. Now, what U.S. government is doing is looking at those data and determining whether a recommendation can be put in clinical guidelines to use dexamethasone in those sick hospitalized patients. We have a number of other antivirals that are being looked at in clinical trials now. We're hoping to see some data about those in the next several months. What I can promise you is that FDA will look at those data when they're available, and we will make a decision about safety and effectiveness based upon those data. No other consideration, but where do the science, data, and medicine lead us? You bring up convalescent plasma, and I just want to step back and just remind everyone that convalescent plasma is where you take the liquid protein part of a person's blood, called plasma, from someone who has recovered from COVID-19. And in that plasma contains the natural immunity that that person has developed. You can take that plasma and give it to 1, 2, or 3 patients, match their blood type, give that to them. This has worked in other infectious diseases. And our preliminary data for this approach, because we've been working with the Mayo Clinic on an expanded access program and now have over 25,000 patients who've been treated with it, the preliminary data that's been published by the Mayo Clinic shows that it's safe, which is great news in terms of this being a therapeutic. Now, what we're waiting for is the efficacy data. How well does it work? We have some preliminary information that's encouraging, but we have to review all the data that's available to us. If those data show that this is an efficacious treatment for COVID-19 patients, it's yet another weapon in the armamentarium. And the reason this is important is because not only does this give us another treatment, we can start collecting plasma from those folks who've recovered. And remember, with the 2.2 million folks who've had the infection, there are a lot of Americans who'd be willing to actually donate plasma. But it'll tell us something about antibodies. And do antibodies actually protect against this virus? It can also give us information about what type of antibodies and the dose that you need. Because the next therapeutic that's being looked at is something called monoclonal antibodies, which are really genetically engineered or synthetic antibodies. So very similar to the plasma antibodies, except for they're specific against the virus and they're manufactured genetically. And we should have a readout from those studies in late summer, early fall. And our hope is that if we can have several of those antibodies available, they'll act as a bridge with plasma to the development of a vaccine. So yet another therapeutic to the armamentarium. Obviously, there's a lot of work to do. We are accelerating the clinical trials in a variety of ways, but we hope to have those answers as soon as possible. And then finally, we come to vaccines. And as you know, there's been a lot in the news about vaccines. Americans are very interested in the information around vaccines. I want to highlight one point, and that is we will use the science and data to make our decisions. We don't make decisions to make press releases. We make decisions about the safety and the efficacy of the products for the American people. So we are helping sponsors, and as you mentioned, there are a number of sponsors developing vaccines. We're trying to help them answer the questions. What are the data that FDA is going to need to help determine safety and efficacy? As we work with them, they'll come in with information to us. And when those data are available, we'll make the decision that we feel is in the best interest of the American people. And I promise the American people that we will make that on the basis of the data and the science and the medicine.
Now, we'll talk a little bit more about the vaccines, and thank you for going through all of that because it provides a really good landscape of where we stand with each of those prospective therapies and the vaccines, of course. But as we look across the country, we're seeing increased rates of individuals getting COVID. And with that, we're seeing reports also of hospitalizations increasing as well. As you think about that armament that is being developed and all of those therapies, do you then expect that we're going to see less patients ultimately die, even in the course of these next several weeks, as we have options potentially more available to us now than we did in March and April? Or do you expect that the trend rate potentially with that lag effect might be the same as we see more people potentially entering hospitals?
I mean, that's a really good question. And of course, it's on everyone's mind these days as we see these cases around the country. And these cases represent real people who are getting sick with COVID-19. It's complicated. And I'll tell you why. It doesn't have to be, and I can explain this. It depends on who's getting COVID-19. So throughout this pandemic, our best efforts have been around protecting the most vulnerable, protecting those in nursing homes, protecting those with coexisting illness such as obesity and hypertension, diabetes, that we know increase the risk of being hospitalized and having death associated with COVID-19. So what we need to understand is who is actually getting COVID-19 now. Now, that being said, we now have remdesivir. We potentially have dexamethasone, and we potentially have plasma. And if we have evidence that they reduce the mortality, then yes, I am very optimistic that they will actually help in terms of affecting the mortality associated with the disease. I do think the medical community has gotten better, and I mean, they're already outstanding in the United States, but we've learned more about how to handle the disease, and I think that can only help us as we move forward. Now, I learned years ago as a cancer doctor, one thing I don't have is a crystal ball, so I can't tell you and your audience what's going to happen. Right now, increased cases, really remarkably low death rate compared to what it was in March and April, as you described. We'll see how that changes with time. My hope is as we learn more about these therapies and we put them out there, that will have a positive impact on mortality. And in addition, I want to encourage Americans to continue to protect their loved ones with vulnerabilities. That is the number one thing that Americans can do. So if you're not someone in a vulnerable group and you're going outside, try to avoid big crowds. If you have to go to big crowds for whatever reason, wear a mask. Social distancing is important. Hand hygiene is important. And remember, when you come home to see those who are vulnerable, please protect them and try to avoid close contact and wear a mask if you've had any hint of an exposure.
Absolutely. You've mentioned, of course, the need for robust science and data, that you don't make decisions based on press release, for example. On the vaccine side, as we are thinking about how do we start to have equitable access and distribution for a potential vaccine, if one is available at the end of the fall or potentially into early 2021, how are those plans being developed in terms of who will have access in the medium term, who might have access in the long term? How do we start to message to vulnerable communities on the ground, the basis of those vaccines that are going to be well studied based on sound science, that they can trust those vaccines when they do become available, if they become available?
This is just an absolutely critical issue. Public trust in the decisions we make are very, very important. And I'll describe FDA's role as well as the rest of U.S. government. So with respect to the questions you had regarding distribution, communication is important, supplies are important, and of course a plan, the logistics around how you're going to get the vaccine to people is very important. And one could imagine, and I don't want to prejudge this, but one could imagine a scenario where you want to vaccinate the most vulnerable first, right? Because they're the ones who are most at risk for mortality, for death from COVID-19. Now, again, I'm not prejudging this. I'm not saying it's the plan. But we have a whole team in U.S. government at the Health and Human Services Department that's working on this. They are part of something called Operation Warp Speed. Now, Operation Warp Speed has a component that is very much facilitating the development of vaccines and therapeutics as well. But there's also a logistics component of this, of how do we make sure we have the right syringes? How do we make sure the right supply? How do we make sure we have the distribution down? And so they are working on that. Now, FDA's role is to actually provide information about all those supplies. And so if you think of what goes into a vaccine, you have the syringe, you might have the needle, you have the manufacturing of the actual vaccine, you have the filling of the what we call the finished filled form of the vaccine. All of those are under the jurisdiction and regulation of FDA. So we're providing to all sponsors, not just U.S. government, not just Operation Warp Speed, but companies around the world, frankly. We're providing technical assistance about where are those supplies, what would we expect to see with respect to manufacturing, what are registered manufacturers that we think can produce high quality product. So all of those things we're working on proactively with the various sponsors, including the U.S. government. And then one final point that I wanted to make, I personally and the FDA has drawn a very bright line between all of those sponsors, including the rest of U.S. government, Operation Warp Speed, that's involved in the development of therapeutics and vaccines. We must retain our independence, our regulatory independence. We must be able to look at the data we receive and make a decision about safety and efficacy about vaccines and therapeutics based upon that science and data, not upon any other consideration. So we are not involved in that other decision-making. We are providing technical assistance. This is very critical that we communicate this to the American people because it goes to the core of trust and public trust in what the FDA does.
And to that end, are we ensuring a diverse patient population are being enrolled in the clinical trials as well as older adults? whom, as you know, their immune system is weakened as you age?
I mean, absolutely, and really superb question. And you're exactly right. As people age, their immune system becomes less effective. So including vulnerable populations, including underrepresented populations is critically important. FDA is working on guidance around all of these issues for manufacturers. And part of that will be guidelines and recommendations about seeing those populations in the vaccine studies. We're seeing what happens in vulnerable communities now with this pandemic, and we absolutely must make sure that this vaccine works and is safe in all communities, regardless of their status in the United States.
Well, I'm sure that will bring a lot of reassurance to people on the ground hearing that. The FDA does a lot more than COVID-19, and there are a lot of product sponsors who are potentially concerned about any delays in ongoing clinical trials. The FDA has been at the forefront of providing a lot of guidance documents to product sponsors around the potential for them to use different tools, telemedicine and other tools, to continue those ongoing clinical trials. Can you talk a little bit about how product sponsors are faring during this time? Are they getting sufficient information to manage their clinical trials during this remote virtual work from most of us around the country?
Yeah, really excellent question. As you know, drug development, I'm a cancer doc, so cancer drug development, but every sort of drug development, all the medical products require robust clinical trials. We have provided a lot of guidance on how one could convert a clinical trial from the pre-COVID era to the COVID era. So remote visits, other flexibilities around tests that might need to be done, et cetera, so that we can have some continuity in the collection of data and we don't have to go back to square one in the development process. We've been working very closely with the sponsors, pharmaceutical companies, academics, et cetera, around their clinical trials. The one thing that I'd say to all the sponsors out there who might be listening, we want to work with you. If you have concerns, please come to us. We learn from you, and we can issue guidances based upon the particular challenges that you have. Now, even in the absence of those guidances, we can give you technical assistance. So we want to hear about those challenges. We've already heard about the substantial challenges that are out there with sponsors. And what we want to do is make sure that within the bounds of reason and science and medicine, that we can provide the guidance and enough regulatory flexibility so that we can get to the right answer regarding the safety and the efficacy of drugs and other medical products. And just one other point that I want to make here. We are in the midst of what's called our coronavirus responsiveness and review, formal sort of action review process, which means that we've been talking about it for the last 8 weeks, but for the last several weeks, we're undergoing a formal review of our response to coronavirus and the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we want to do is ask, of those things, for example, the flexibility around clinical trials that we've provided during coronavirus in the era of telemedicine that we know will continue, what can we keep? What can we do more of? What can we do better? Because we're a learning organization, and part of that is engaging stakeholders, finding out what you think we can do better, what are the challenges you're facing, and how our regulatory flexibilities and our guidances can help you do your job better. So I wanted to be able to announce that as I did yesterday and just let you know that we are very much looking forward to making some permanent changes on the basis of what we learned, and then revising what we've done if the challenges change in a certain direction. That's where we are right now, and I look forward to working with all our stakeholders on that.
You know, that's a fantastic announcement. Are there things that are giving you hope right now? For example, with platform clinical trials and seeing so many of them being stood up around the world, that is a potential benefit learning, silver lining of COVID-19, as well as the potential for decentralized clinical trials, remote patient monitoring. As you are thinking about and working on this review, what's giving you hope from what you've already seen?
Well, you know what? Well, first of all, what's giving me hope is the incredible response from the American people who have risen to the challenge, and the American private sector, and the world's private sector, frankly. We have seen people come together in a way in response to the COVID-19 pandemic that we haven't seen in a long time, and it's incredibly gratifying. It gives me hope that we will come out of this even stronger, as Americans always do. And so I see that, and you've spoken about a lot of the clinical trial work that has been done, the way that we've approached it, we meaning the clinical trial community, including FDA, and we will continue to institute those. One thing I want to highlight that I think will be top of mind for us is around the collection of data. COVID-19 has reminded us that what we need are more accurate, more reliable, and speedier access to data across the board. We are a data-driven organization at FDA. We need data about supply chain. We need data about drug supply. We need data about demand of PPE, of ventilators, of drugs, of diagnostic tests. We need data about real-world use of tests and how that will influence our regulatory decisions. So one of the really positive things that will come out of this is that we've stood up a real-world evidence accelerator with the Reagan-Udall Foundations and Friends of NIH to actually collect data to help us look back on our decisions around emergency use authorization. And then how can we use those real-world data to actually change that decision or not, to verify that was the correct decision to begin with. This is a strength of our efforts. It's something that I believe we should welcome because every time we make a decision, we have a certain data set. But as we accumulate more data in the real world, that should influence what we say going forward about that particular product. I really think that this is going to be a major breakthrough for the agency. I think it's going to be a major breakthrough for other regulatory bodies around the world. And I think it's going to be a breakthrough for the American people.
Well, I think that is fantastic in terms of what gives you hope. I do think there's a lot of promise with real-world evidence and data, and we're collecting it in rapid form. Thank you so much for your leadership and all that the agency is doing on behalf of the American people. Truly, lives are in your hand. It is more important now than ever. So we wish you luck with everything that you're doing and success. So thank you for joining us today.
Really appreciate your time, and my best to all your viewers. Please stay safe.